If Priest were to have a fourth spec, I think a Holy DPS spec would work well. I'd call it the Divine Specialization. Priests have always been in a unique situation, as the only class with two healing specs. As such, players that really enjoy healing tend to gravitate toward the class, and it's not uncommon to find a healing priest that simply has no interest in playing Shadow. Disciplined priests especially have been walking the line between healing and DPS for some time now, and I think it would fit very well to have a priest DPS that incorporates some healing into its playstyle. Perhaps this could both persuade healing priests to give DPS a chance, and shadow priests to become more interested in healing. The real benefit of any class having multiple DPS specs is giving each spec a slight advantage or utility in one way or the other. Shadow priests bring with them a raid healing cooldown in the way of Vampiric Embrace. They excel in situations where they can multi-dot, and they also have a very strong cooldown with Dispersion. For the Divine Priest, I'd like to see the focus taken away from the dots and placed as a natural progression to how a Disciplined Priest with Atonement deals damage. So I've been playing the Hearthstone beta for some time now, and there is a particularly interesting card available to priests known as the Light Spawn. This minion card is the main inspiration for my Divine Priest specialization idea. In Hearthstone, you can buff your minion cards to increase their potency. So the idea came to me that having a pet for a holy DPS priest would be a very clever fit. The minion could act as a secondary resource for the Divine Priest, as well as a target that the priest would buff and heal. The Lightspawn pet would carry with it a resource that could only be generated by the Divine Priest. The resource would simply be called Light, and would have a familiar range between 0 and 100. Heals from the priest would generate light, and light would be expended from the light spawn for damaging abilities. In this sense, the Divine Priest would have the ability to pool light for burst damage. The light spawn would take significantly increased healing from the Divine Priest, and significantly reduced healing from everyone else. The DPS version of Atonement that they would have would be directed only to the light spawn. The goal isn't for the Divine Priest to be a DPS that passively heals the raid, but rather a DPS that does have a focus on healing which doesn't affect the overall healing of the raid. The DPS version of Atonement would generate light slowly, while direct heals would increase light levels much more rapidly. Power Word Shield would grant the light spawn a significant buff, making it, in a sense, part of the rotation. So as far as actual DPS abilities, the Divine Spec would utilize Smite and Holy Fire as core abilities. They would also have a reversed version of Penance that brought with it a heavier damage component and a lighter healing component. Prayer of Mending would be adapted for the spec to deal damage when cast on enemies, which would help mitigate the lack of dots in AoE situations. Holy Nova would return as a baseline ability for the Divine Priest, and the current glyph would be converted into a modification of the ability. The Light Spawn would deal damage from a distance and have abilities it could channel that would consume its light resource. These abilities would be toggleable by the priest in order to throttle light consumption to use as burst damage. Light Spawns could use a similar version of Holy Nova for AoE, or Penance for single target burst. Mastery would increase all the damage your pet dealt. In the absence of Dispersion, the Light Spawn could offer a cooldown to shield the Divine Priest. And as for a raid cooldown that would incorporate the focus placed on the Light Spawn, damage would be redirected to the Light Spawn until it had reached a low health threshold or the cooldown ended, meaning a skilled priest that really focused on the healing during the cooldown would be able to extend the duration of the cooldown to its maximum potential. As a pet, the Light Spawn would provide a haste buff for the raid and would have a significant AoE damage reduction just like other pets. Divine Priests would share spiritual precision with Shadow Priests, and mana generation would be tied to the use of Holy Fire. Looking over the talents, some changes would need to be made to accommodate the Divine Spec. The first, fourth, and sixth tiers would work fine with a Holy DPS, so we can ignore those. In the second tier, I would change Angelic Feather, not to accommodate Divine Priests specifically, but rather all priests in general, because the ability is just plainly really obnoxious to use in raiding right now. I would change it so it had 2 charges on a 3-minute cooldown, recharging just like a Monk's Roll or a Paladin's Clemency. Rather than it being consumed by a single person, up to 5 raid members could utilize it before it despawned. Instead of lasting 10 minutes, though, it would only last for 20 seconds, or until 5 players had consumed a charge. In the 3rd tier, the Divine Spec could be added to Surge of Light, under the From Darkness Comes Light talent, providing them with a proc that they could use both to help the raid or to heal their pet to increase their DPS. Under the Solace and Insanity talent, a specific effect for the Divine Spec would be added, which would offer an additional buff to the light spawn when you applied Renew to it, allowing for another way for the healing-minded priests to heal their way into a damage roll. In the 5th tier, Divine Insight could allow your pet's damaging attacks to cause your next Prayer of Mending to trigger all of its stacks on a single target instantly, without incurring a cooldown or costing any mana. So that's my take on a 4th spec for priests. What do you think? What would you like to see in a 4th spec for priests? Let me know in the comments section below. Thanks for watching, and be sure to check out my channel for some other videos.